Psalm 139. It's probably the second most favorite psalm in the Psalter, second only to Psalm 23. It's the one we love. It's the one I hear the most chosen for funerals. The Reverend Dr. Will Gaffney translated the 9-verse portion appointed for today for the Women's Lectionary. Rarely in worship do we hear all 24 verses in a row. It's a little long. But I do want to share with you at least 5 more verses for reflection today, so you can hear what I consider to be the first 2 sections of the psalm. Before we jump to verse 7. Source of life, you have searched me out and known me. You know my sitting down and my rising up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You trace my journeys and my resting places and are acquainted with all my ways. Indeed, even before a word is on my tongue, O Creator, you know it completely. You hem me in behind and before and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is so high that I cannot attain it. In a world in which we long for human connection, which we long for love and acceptance, this prayer is a simple and pleasing articulation of what it means to be known fully by God. More especially, it articulates what it's like to know that we are known and loved by God fully. There's a fancy theological word for this. I had to practice pronouncing it. Omniscience. Omniscience. Omni, all from Latin. Scientia, knowledge. Put them together, all-knowing. The knowledge of God is so comprehensive and exhaustive that God knows our actions, thoughts, and words even before they manifest. There's this hint of this idea in the psalmist too, that even this notion of omniscience is too much to grasp. It's too wonderful for me. I cannot attain it. It's like when we describe God as the peace which surpasses all understanding. And yet as comfortable, comforting as it can be in some seasons of life, to be reminded of how intimately we are known by God, there, I think, are also seasons in which this being known gets a little bit more complex. We struggle, do we not, with this fear of really being known. Being known as we desire to be known. Maybe this stems from those classic experiences of opening ourselves up in vulnerability to others only then to experience hurt. So that fear is, of course, a natural human coping mechanism to protect us, to protect ourselves. We can go to great lengths to not be known fully. We hide our true identities from others, even and especially sometimes from God. And so if the first chunk of the prayer is about God's omniscience, then this next section of the prayer speaks to God's omnipresence. Where can I go from your spirit? Or where from your presence can I flee? If I ascend to the heavens, there you are. If I recline in Sheol, there it is you. If I take up dawn's wings, if I settle at the farthest reaches of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me fast. If I say, surely darkness shall cover me, and night will become light behind me, even darkness is not dark to you. Night is as daylight, for dark is the same as light. So whether one reads these verses as good news or as complex perhaps depends on how outwardly our authentic selves align with who we know ourselves to be inwardly. It cannot be assumed that these verses 7 through 12 are always, at all times, received by us as good news. There's this potential desperation I read in the voice of the psalmist, of God's being all present everywhere. It is in fact like feeling God is inescapable. It cannot escape from God's gaze. Many of us were surprised in the Lenten series led by the Reverend Robert Phillips that this was an example of a lament psalm, a complaint to God. Oh, but we love this psalm. It can't be a complaint. Well, just literarily it is. Those parts of ourselves that we hide from others, the things we don't want others to know, the places we go when we want to hide. This psalm is saying, well, just try. Just try and keep those things from God. Ultimately, the psalmist acknowledges, realizes that being vulnerable is worthwhile when God is the one to whom we open ourselves. The prayer accepts God's inescapable presence, affirming one's identity as seen through God's eyes. For it was you who crafted my inward parts. You wove me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am awesomely and marvelously made. Wondrous are your works, that my soul knows full well. We need to mention the goals of the women's lectionary. In these verses, Dr. Gaffney points out the rare metaphor describing God as a weaver or a knitter, traditionally women's work. When we read this psalm in conversation with that passage from Genesis, that portion of the creation story, the psalmist is there in the fullness of their gender, neither fully man nor fully woman, handcrafted though by God in the holy darkness of the earth's womb herself. What an appropriate image for this last day of Pride Month. And so how might the Spirit be speaking to us through this text today? For me, I hear at least two messages, one of consolation and one of caution to practice humility. The consolation is in God's intimate knowledge of each of us. When we consciously choose to accept the love that is always on offer, rather than in vain trying to hide the parts that we hide from others from God. One commentator wrote about Psalm 139 that it reminded him of the Margaret Wise Brown children's book, The Runaway Bunny. Anyone? A baby bunny tells his mother he plans to run away, but she can go to extraordinary lengths to find him. If he becomes a fish in a stream, she'll become a fisher so she can catch him. If he becomes a bird, she will become the tree in which he can rest. If he becomes a little human boy, she will become his mother so that he can come home to her. Shucks, the baby bunny concludes, I might as well stay here and be your little bunny. Have a carrot, she says. Like the bunny's mother, there is nowhere we can escape from God except God's own arms of loving kindness. So why not hug God back? The message of caution that I hear is to practice humility. What I mean is that this has to do with reminding ourselves that the truths of this psalm apply equally to all people. To make it even more plain, the truths of this psalm apply to all presidential candidates. They apply to those who will vote differently than us, to those we love, to those whom we struggle to love. As a pastor, I am acutely aware of how scared many of us are about the state of our country and the state of our world. This past week's presidential debate was only the first of many more moments of ugliness and confusion which will unfold over the rest of the year. For good reason, I've heard from some in our community who are seriously thinking out loud about moving abroad because of the risks of the election results. Not all have that privilege, have that choice. And it seems to me that certainly many of us with privilege are called to stay in our country no matter what, to stand up for what we believe in. As we have explored in this psalm today, we've journeyed through these themes of being known by God, of God's inescapable presence. We've considered how that can be both comforting and complex. The divine omniscience, the divine omnipresence. We marvel at the intimate knowledge that God has of each of us. We recognize that that knowledge extends to each and every person made in God's own image. The psalmist's words remind us that there is nowhere we can go where God is not present, no part of ourselves that God does not already know and love. Even in the darkest moments or the farthest reaches, God's hands of mercy, love, and forgiveness are there and extended to us to guide and to hold. In a world that feels divided and uncertain, may we be beacons of God's omniscient love and omnipresent care, offering acceptance and compassion to all, just as God does for us. Amen.